Every day, at the exact same hour, an old German shepherd would appear at the edge of the forest and silently watch the cabin of a veteran who was trying to escape the world. It never begged for food. It never barked. It simply stood guard, like a soldier on a secret mission. But on the day the blizzard hit, for the first time ever, it did not appear. For the lonely sentry in the cabin, that absence was more terrifying than the roar of the storm, because he knew that this silence was not peace, but a desperate cry for help. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The rumble of the engine was the last sound of the world Ben wanted to remember. He stood on the porch of his small timber cabin, arms crossed over his chest, watching the faded blue delivery truck navigate the rutted dirt track that served as his driveway. The driver, a young man with a cheerful, round face who had introduced himself as Gus, gave a final, enthusiastic wave. Ben offered only a stiff, curt nod in return. The gesture was a dismissal, a final severing of the last link. Gus seemed to get the message. With a shrug, he turned his focus back to the treacherous path, and soon the truck disappeared behind a thick stand of pine trees. The sound of its engine faded, swallowed by the immense, waiting silence of the Appalachian Mountains. Then there was nothing. Nothing but the whisper of the wind through the high branches and the distant cry of a hawk. This was what he had paid for. This was what he had sought. Silence. Absolute and unbroken. Ben remained on the porch for a long moment, a statue carved from solitude. He was 45 years old, but the hardships etched on his face made him look older. His tall, lean frame was deceptively strong, honed by years of military discipline and the hard labor that now filled his days. His brown hair was cut short, practical, with threads of distinguished silver feathering at his temples. It was his eyes that told the real story. They were a deep, clear blue, but they held a weariness, a guardedness that kept the world at a distance. He had moved here, to this forgotten patch of West Virginia, to build a fortress not of wood and stone, but of quiet. A fortress against the ghosts that noise always seemed to awaken. He turned and went inside. The cabin was like him, sparse, functional, and devoid of comfort for comfort's sake. A single room served as his living space, with a small, efficient wood stove, a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed tucked into the far corner, its wool blanket folded with military precision. There were no photographs on the walls, no books scattered about, no television. Everything had a purpose. Anything that did not serve a direct, practical function had been left behind in the life he had systematically dismantled. This was not a home. It was a forward operating base in his war against memory. His days fell into a rhythm as rigid and unyielding as the mountain stone. He woke before the sun, his body still wired to an internal clock set in another time zone, another lifetime. The cold mountain air was a shock to the system, a welcome distraction. First came the wood, the swing of the axe, the sharp crack as the steel bit into seasoned oak, the satisfying thud as the logs split. It was methodical work, physical and demanding. It left no room for thought. Chop, stack, repeat. When his muscles burned and his breathing was ragged, he would stop, but only for a moment. Next was the perimeter check. He would walk the edge of his 10-acre property, his stride long and even, his eyes scanning the dense woods that pressed in from all sides. He wasn't looking for intruders, not human ones anyway. He was checking for fallen trees, signs of animal trails, the subtle shifts in the landscape. It was a habit ingrained in him, the need to know his territory, to be aware of his surroundings. He was a sentry guarding an empty post. The rest of the day was filled with the quiet labor of self-sufficiency, tending his small vegetable garden, cleaning his tools until they shone, preparing simple, solitary meals. He welcomed the exhaustion that settled into his bones each evening. It was a clean feeling, an honest fatigue that helped keep the nightmares at bay. He cherished the silence, courted it, depended on it. Yet, sometimes, in the moments between tasks, it would turn on him. It would become a vast, empty space, a vacuum that his thoughts would rush to fill. In those moments, the quiet was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, amplifying the echoes in his own mind. The silence was both his shield and his cage. It was during one of these moments, late one afternoon, that his world tilted on its axis. He was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun begin its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The air was still. The woods were quiet. He had just finished cleaning his axe, and the scent of oil and pine hung in the air. His mind was blessedly, momentarily, blank. And then he saw her. At the edge of the tree line, where the forest floor gave way to the cleared patch of his yard, a figure stood motionless. It was a dog, a German shepherd, large and beautifully built, even from a distance. Its coat was a striking mix of gray and white, like smoke and ash, a ghost against the deepening shadows of the woods. But it was the dog's posture that held him captive. It was not the stance of a lost or wandering animal. It stood with a profound stillness, a quiet dignity, its head held high, its intelligent eyes fixed directly on him. There was an air of purpose about it, a sense of duty. It looked like a soldier on watch. Ben didn't move. He didn't breathe. The world seemed to shrink to the space between him and this silent observer. There was no growl, no bark, not even the flick of a tail. There was only the steady, unnerving gaze. He could see the silver in its muzzle, the wisdom of age in its calm demeanor. For a long, stretched-out minute, they simply looked at each other, two solitary beings in a land of silence. Then, as quietly as she had appeared, the dog turned her head. With a final, lingering glance, she pivoted with a smooth, unhurried grace and melted back into the forest. One moment she was there, a stark, gray and white presence, and the next she was gone, leaving only the trees and the encroaching twilight. Ben continued to stare at the spot where she had been, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that surprised him. The silence she left behind was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a question. The next morning, the silence felt different. It was no longer a simple absence of noise, but a vessel of anticipation. Ben went about his morning chores with his usual unwavering discipline, yet his focus was divided. As he split logs, each swing of the axe felt like a tick of a clock, counting down to the late afternoon. His perimeter check was slower, more deliberate, his eyes lingering on the tree line where she had vanished. He was a man who had built his life on rigid, predictable patterns, and a new, unscheduled element had been introduced. It was an anomaly, and his soldier's mind could not dismiss it. He told himself it was a fluke, a stray dog on its route, a chance encounter that would not be repeated. But as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across his yard, he found himself on the porch, waiting. He felt a flicker of annoyance at his own behavior, at this crack in his fortress of solitude. Then she appeared. Just as before, she emerged from the woods at the exact same spot, moving with a silent grace that belied her age. The German shepherd, his ghost of gray and white, walked to her designated position and sat, her posture as straight and formal as a guardsman at his post. She looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. There was no pleading in her eyes, no friendliness, just a profound and patient watchfulness. She stayed for nearly an hour, a silent sentinel, before rising and disappearing back into the forest. The second day became the third, and the third became a week. The pattern never varied. The time, the place, the silent vigil, it was all repeated with a precision that Ben found both unsettling and fascinating. This was not random. This was not the behavior of a stray. Strays were opportunistic, always moving, always searching. This dog was the opposite. She was deliberate, steadfast. Ben began to understand. This was not a visit. It was a ritual, a solemn, daily ceremony, performed for reasons he could not fathom. He started calling her the Gray Ghost in his mind. The name fit her ethereal appearances and disappearances, her silent, watchful nature. His initial irritation, the The feeling of being invaded slowly began to erode. It was replaced by something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A deep, consuming curiosity. Who was she? Where did she come from? What was the purpose of her vigil? The questions circled in his mind during the long, quiet hours. This curiosity was soon joined by a feeling he recognized from his former life: respect. As a soldier, Ben understood discipline. He had lived by it, survived because of it. And he saw that same unwavering discipline in the Gray Ghost. She never missed her appointment. Rain or shine, she was there. She never complained, never sought attention. She simply performed her duty. He found himself admiring her fortitude, her sheer, stubborn consistency. He, who had spent years trying to maintain his own rigid control, saw a master of the craft sitting at the edge of his woods. He was a sentry guarding an empty post. She was a sentry with a purpose he just couldn't see yet. His own routine began to subtly shift, reorienting itself around hers. His wood chopping would finish just before she was due to arrive. His walk of the perimeter would end with him settling onto the porch steps, a silent audience for her daily rite. It became an unspoken appointment. He would not approach her, and she would not approach him. They maintained their distance, separated by a gulf of grass and unspoken questions, yet they shared this time together. Her presence became a fixed point in his drifting existence, a strange new anchor in his carefully curated emptiness. The silence between them was no longer the hollow, suffocating silence of his own mind. It was a shared silence, filled with the weight of her mysterious purpose. It was a silence that made him feel, paradoxically, a little less alone. He would watch the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the occasional thoughtful cock of her head as a bird called out from the canopy. He was studying her, gathering intelligence, trying to understand the nature of her mission. After 2 weeks of this silent ritual, Ben knew he could no longer remain a passive observer. The mystery of the Gray Ghost had taken root in his mind, growing into an obsession that overshadowed the very ghosts he had come here to escape. The quiet of the mountains was no longer enough. He needed an answer. Her daily appearance was no longer a strange interruption. It had become the most significant event of his day, and he realized with a jolt that he had come to depend on it. That dependence was a dangerous thing, but the need to know was stronger. As he watched her rise and melt back into the woods one evening, he made a decision. The questions were too loud to ignore. Tomorrow, the ritual would change. The decision, once made, settled in Ben's gut with the familiar weight of a mission plan. He would no longer be a spectator. He needed intelligence. The next day, he broke his own rigid schedule. Instead of starting on the woodpile after his perimeter check, he headed directly for the tree line, moving with a quiet purpose that had been honed on harsher terrains than this. He felt a strange sense of trespass, of crossing a line that had been respected for weeks, but the drive to understand was stronger than his reluctance. He approached the spot where the Gray Ghost held her daily vigil. Up close, he saw it was a small, natural clearing, slightly elevated, offering a clear, unobstructed view of his cabin. A large, flat-topped boulder, dappled with moss, sat at the center. It was a perfect observation post. He ran a hand over the stone. It was smooth, worn down by time, and he suspected, by the loyal sentinel who claimed it. Ben scanned the ground with a practiced eye, his gaze sweeping in slow, methodical arcs. He looked for tracks, for a worn path, for any sign that would tell him more about his mysterious visitor, and then he saw it. Tucked against the base of the boulder, half hidden by a season's worth of fallen pine needles, was a small knot of faded color. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and carefully brushed the debris away. It was a tennis ball. Or, it had been one, long ago. The bright, synthetic yellow had faded to a sickly, greenish-gray. The felt was worn away in patches, revealing the dark, cracked rubber underneath. It was feather-light, brittle with age and exposure to the elements. He picked it up, and it felt as fragile as a bird's egg in his calloused hand. Holding the ball, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Ben's mind. This was not a stray's temporary resting place. This was a destination. This ball was a relic, a ghost of a happier time, a time of play, of companionship. It spoke of a life before the silent, solemn ritual. The dog's daily pilgrimage was not just a habit, it was an act of profound remembrance. Her loyalty was not to him, but to a memory that was rooted in this very spot. A story had happened here, and she was its faithful keeper. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. He, who ran from his past, was witnessing a creature who honored hers with unwavering devotion. A deep respect, stronger than before, settled over him. He felt like an intruder who had stumbled upon a sacred memorial. Carefully, he placed the worn-out ball back exactly where he had found it, gently covering it again with pine needles. He had his answer, or at least, part of it. The gray ghost was not just a dog, she was a guardian of a memory. He retreated to his cabin, his mind reeling, to wait for her arrival, now seeing her not as an enigma, but as a fellow soldier standing her post. That night, the discovery churned something loose inside him. The thoughts of loyalty, of duties kept, and memories held, had unsettled the carefully packed soil of his mind. Sleep did not come easy, and when it did, it brought no peace. It brought the dream. It was never a clear narrative, but a chaotic assault of the senses. The oppressive heat, the taste of sand and cordite in his mouth. The world seen through a haze of dust, the sun a merciless white disk in the sky. There was shouting, confused and desperate, the deafening roar of an engine, the high-pitched whine that came before the blast. And then, the silence. A different kind of silence. Not the peace of the mountains, but a ringing, hollow void filled with failure and the faces of men he could no longer help. Ben awoke with a violent jerk, his body drenched in sweat, the rough wool blanket tangled around his legs like a snare. He sat bolt upright, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner. The familiar terror washed over him, cold and paralyzing. The cabin was pitch black, but the images from the dream were seared onto the backs of his eyelids. He clutched his head in his hands, trying to ground himself, trying to remember where he was. The mountain silence rushed in, but tonight it offered no comfort. It was an accomplice to the echoing void in his mind. Panic began to claw at his throat. This was the enemy he could never defeat, the ghost that couldn't be seen. Just as the wave of despair threatened to pull him under, a new image rose, unbidden, in his mind. It was the gray ghost. He saw her as clearly as if she were there in the room with him, sitting on her mossy rock. He pictured her calm, steady posture, the dignified set of her head, the unwavering patience in her old eyes. He focused on the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, a steady beat in a world of chaos. He envisioned her silent, steadfast presence, a being completely anchored in her purpose, her discipline, her absolute, unshakable control. The image was a lighthouse in his internal storm. He clung to it, focusing all his energy on the details, the white fur of her muzzle, the intelligent flick of her ears, the profound peace in her stillness. The shouting in his memory began to fade. The frantic hammering in his chest began to slow, matching the calm rhythm of her breathing. The panic receded, the wave breaking against the unmovable rock of her image. For the first time since he had come to this place, something from his new life had proven stronger than the horrors of his old one. Ben sat on the edge of his bed in the quiet darkness, his breathing slowly evening out. The terror was gone, replaced by a deep, aching sense of gratitude for the silent sentinel at the edge of the woods, the guardian who had stood her post and, without ever knowing it, had just guided him safely back to shore. The gratitude Ben felt in the deep, quiet hours of the night lingered into the morning, a strange warmth in the center of his chest. It was a new feeling, and it sat uneasily alongside the solitude he had so carefully constructed. He awoke to a different world. The clear, crisp autumn air had vanished. replaced by a damp, biting wind that carried the first true threat of winter. The sky was no longer a vibrant blue, but a low, oppressive ceiling of uniform gray. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, a cold that promised worse to come. Ben went about his morning routine, but the change in the weather had planted a seed of concern in his mind. He found himself thinking of the gray ghost, picturing her sitting on that exposed rock, facing the raw wind. He imagined the cold penetrating her old bones, her gray and white coat offering little comfort against the damp chill. The image was a persistent, unwelcome guest in his thoughts. A war began inside him. The part of him that had built this fortress, the disciplined soldier who survived by cutting attachments, argued with cold logic. She is not your responsibility. She has survived this long without you. Getting involved is a mistake. It is a weakness. He tried to listen to that voice. It was the voice that had kept him safe, that had insulated him from the pain of a world he no longer understood. But another voice, one he had long suppressed, pushed back. It was the memory of her calming presence, pulling him from the depths of his nightmare. It was the profound respect he felt for her unwavering loyalty. He saw her not as an animal, but as a fellow veteran, an old soldier standing her post no matter the conditions. And you did not leave a soldier in the field without support. The internal battle raged as he chopped wood, the rhythmic impact of the axe, a counterpoint to the turmoil in his mind. The cold was a constant reminder. By midday, the war was over. He could not sit in his warm cabin, knowing she was out there in the biting wind, without doing something. The principle of self-preservation had been defeated by the principle of compassion. He went inside and opened his small pantry. His supplies were carefully rationed, meant to last him through the harshest parts of winter. He took out a piece of beef jerky, thick and protein-rich, a practical food meant for sustenance. He held it in his hand for a moment. This was more than just food. It was a message. It was a breach of his own protocol. With a deep breath, he walked out onto the porch and down the steps, crossing the yard to the edge of the woods. He placed the jerky on the flat top of the mossy boulder, a simple, deliberate offering. He felt a profound sense of stepping over a line from which there might be no return. He retreated to his cabin, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. As the afternoon light began to fade, he took up his own post, watching from the cabin window. Right on schedule, she emerged from the trees. The gray ghost walked to her clearing, her movements perhaps a little stiffer in the cold. She stopped short when she reached the boulder. Her head lowered slightly, and her old, intelligent nose twitched, sampling the air. She saw the jerky. For a long moment, she did not move. She looked at the offering, then her gaze lifted and met Ben's Akem, even through the glass of the window. It was a long, unreadable look, a silent question. Ben's instinct was to stay, to watch, to ensure she took it. But he understood this was a negotiation, a delicate dance of trust and respect. He was the intruder in her ritual. For her to accept his gift, he had to cede the ground to her. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of peace. Then he did the hardest thing he had done all day. He turned away from the window, went to his chair by the cold stove, and sat with his back to her, granting her the privacy and space she deserved. He was showing her that he was not a threat, that his offering came with no strings attached. He waited, the silence in the cabin thick with tension. Every nerve in his body was strained, listening for the slightest sound. After what felt like an eternity, he risked a glance over his shoulder, peering through the corner of the window. She was at the rock. She approached it cautiously, her movements fluid and silent. She sniffed the jerky one last time, then gently took it in her mouth. She didn't devour it greedily. She ate it with a slow, dignified pace. A wave of emotion washed over Ben, so powerful it made him dizzy. It was a feeling of connection, of a message sent and received across a species divide. It was the first breakthrough. When she had finished, she did not leave. She looked toward the cabin for a long moment, a look of quiet assessment, before she hopped onto her boulder and took up her vigil as always. Her ritual continued, but the space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. Two lonely souls, a man and a dog, bound by a silent offering built not on contact, but on mutual respect. The pact held for another week. Each day, Ben would leave a small offering on the stone, and each afternoon, the gray ghost would appear to accept it before beginning her solemn watch. The ritual became the new cornerstone of Ben's existence, a silent conversation that he had come to depend on more than he cared to admit. But the cold that had arrived that first day did not leave. It lingered, and the gray skies grew heavier, pregnant with a promise of winter's true power. The storm arrived without fanfare. It began not with a roar, but with a profound and sudden stillness. The wind died completely. The birds fell silent. An eerie, pale light filtered through the thick cloud cover. Ben, recognizing the signs from a lifetime of paying attention to the world around him, began his preparations. He was a man who understood how to face an enemy. He spent the morning bringing in enough firewood to last for days, stacking it neatly against the interior wall. He checked the seals on the single window and the heavy wooden door. He filled every container he had with fresh water from the pump. His movements were efficient, calm, and methodical. He was in control. The first snowflakes began to fall around noon, large and wet and lazy. Within an hour, they had been replaced by a fine, hard-driven powder, and the wind had returned with a vengeance. It shrieked through the pines, a low, mournful howl that seemed to get inside the cabin walls. Ben lit the wood stove, and its steady warmth was a small comfort against the growing fury outside. He was safe. He was prepared. As the afternoon hours crept by, his gaze kept returning to the window. The world outside was a swirling chaos of white. Visibility was down to a few yards, the familiar shapes of the trees dissolving into faint, ghostly outlines. He watched the clock on the wall, the slow, steady tick marking the approach of the appointed hour. He told himself she would not come. No animal, no matter how dedicated, would venture out in this. She was old, wise. She would be safe in some sheltered den. It was the only logical conclusion. But logic did little to quell the anxiety coiling in his stomach. The time of her usual arrival came and went. Ben stared out the window, his face close to the cold glass, searching the white chaos for a familiar gray shape. There was nothing. The clearing where her rock stood was being buried under a relentless blanket of snow. The stage for their ritual was gone. An hour passed, then 2. The initial worry began to curdle into a subtle, creeping panic. He paced the small cabin, a caged animal, his boots thudding a restless rhythm on the wooden floor. He would stop at the window, search the blizzard for any sign of movement, and then turn away, his jaw clenched tight. The cabin, once his fortress, now felt like a prison. The howling of the wind began to sound like shouting. The swirling snow outside was no longer just weather. It was a visual representation of the chaos he had fought so hard to keep at bay. In that moment, a devastating realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. His routines, his wood chopping, his perimeter walks, they were all just flimsy defenses, just busy work. The true foundation of his fragile peace, the real anchor that had been holding him steady against the tide of his past, was her. It was the gray ghost. Her silent, predictable daily ritual was the single, unwavering point of order in his disordered world. And now, it was gone. Her absence had shattered the fragile structure of his sanity. The carefully constructed walls of his solitude came crashing down, and the ghosts he had held back for so long came rushing into the breach. The ringing silence he had once cultivated was now a terrifying, roaring void, and his memories began to fill it. He could feel the familiar cold sweat on his brow, the frantic, panicked rhythm of his heart. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one about to break inside him. He was losing the fight. The cabin was no longer a safe place. The real enemy was not the blizzard, it was his own mind, left untethered. A decision rose from the panic, not from thought, but from pure, primal instinct. To stay here was to surrender. To stay here was to drown. He had to move. He had to act. He had to find his anchor. His movements became sharp, decisive, driven by a new and desperate mission. The panic was still there, but it was now fuel. He pulled on his thickest wool socks and heavy insulated boots, lacing them with quick, angry tugs. He grabbed his military surplus winter coat from its peg by the door and shrugged it on. He checked the batteries in his heavy-duty flashlight, shoved a protein bar into his pocket, and wrapped a scarf around his face. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a soldier, preparing to step into a combat zone. His objective was clear. This was not just about saving a dog, it was about saving himself. He had to find her. He had to restore the ritual. He had to find the one thing that had proven it could keep the ghosts at bay. With his hand on the heavy iron latch of the door, he took one last, deep breath. Then he opened it. The fury of winter met him with a physical blow, a wall of howling wind and blinding, stinging snow. Ben lowered his head, braced himself against the blast, and took the first step out into the storm. The moment Ben stepped off his porch, the storm consumed him. The wind hit like a solid wall, stealing the air from his lungs and driving icy needles of snow into every inch of his exposed skin. For a moment, he was completely disoriented, a blind man in a world of roaring white chaos. His first instinct was to simply push forward, to fight the storm with brute force, but years of training immediately took over, silencing the panic with cold, hard discipline. He stopped, planted his feet firmly, and turned his back to the wind to create a small pocket of relative calm. He closed his eyes for a second, forcing his mind to work. Navigation was impossible by sight. He needed a different map. His perimeter walks had etched the lay of this land into his memory. He knew the gentle downward slope toward the east, the location of the thick grove of ancient oaks to the north. The wind was coming hard from the northwest. He could use that. It would be his compass. With a plan in place, he began to move. This was no longer a frantic search, it was a calculated traverse. He kept the wind pushing on his right shoulder blade, a constant, brutal pressure guiding his direction. He moved from the shelter of one tree trunk to the next, using them as brief respites from the gale. The snow was a treacherous enemy, hiding dips and rocks, its depth shifting from a few inches to drifts that came up to his waist. Each step was a battle, a test of the endurance that had been drilled into him in places just as unforgiving as this. The physical agony was a strange comfort. It was real. It was a tangible fight, so much simpler than the war inside his own head. His first objective was the Gray Ghost's observation post. It was the only logical starting point. When he finally reached the small clearing, the boulder was a mound of white, almost unrecognizable. He fell to his knees, shielding his flashlight with his body, and began sweeping the beam across the snow. He wiped away layers of fresh powder with his gloved hands, his heart sinking. There was nothing. The storm was erasing the world, wiping the slate clean. He fought down a surge of despair. He had to think like her. Where would she go for shelter? She would not head for open ground. She would follow the trees, use them for cover. He began a circular search pattern, spiraling out from the rock. The flashlight beam cut a frantic, lonely path through the swirling snow. It felt hopeless. He was searching for the faintest depression in a world that was being constantly, violently resurfaced. Then he saw it. Under the low-hanging bough of a hemlock tree, where the snow was slightly less deep, was a faint, oval impression, a paw print, and another, a few feet away. They were already filling with snow, ghosts of a track, but they were there. A surge of adrenaline shot through him, a jolt of renewed purpose. He had the trail. The next hour was a grueling, torturous exercise in concentration. He moved at a crawl, his world shrinking to the small circle of light cast by his flashlight. He would find one faint print, fix its location in his mind, then search for the next, all while the wind tried to tear him from his feet and the snow tried to bury his only clue. He lost the trail a dozen times, forcing him to backtrack, to cast his light in wide, desperate arcs until he found another trace. He did not think about the cold that had long since numbed his cheeks and nose. He did not think about the exhaustion pulling at his limbs. He thought only of the mission. His entire being was focused on this single, desperate task. The alternative, returning to the empty cabin and the roaring chaos of his own mind, was not an option. This physical hell was his salvation. The faint trail in the snow was his lifeline, and he would not let it go. The tracks led him deeper into the woods, into a part of the mountain he had never explored. The trees grew thicker here, offering more protection from the wind. The paw prints became slightly more defined, easier to follow. Hope, fierce and bright, flared in his chest. He was getting closer. He quickened his pace, pushing through low branches that whipped at his face, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The beam of his flashlight suddenly hit something that was not a tree. It was a flat, dark surface, a straight, unnatural line in the organic chaos of the forest. He pushed forward, his legs burning with the effort of wading through a deep drift, and the shape slowly resolved itself from the whiteout. It was a roof, a low, slanted roof, heavy with a thick blanket of snow. He stumbled into a small, sheltered clearing and saw it clearly. A small cabin, barely more than a one-room shack, almost completely consumed by the snow. Drifts were piled high against its walls, reaching nearly to the windows. The paw prints he had been following so desperately led directly to a low door at the back of the structure. There were no tracks leading away. She was here. He was sure of it. He had completed the first part of his mission. He stood before the silent, snow-shrouded cabin, his body screaming with exhaustion, the wind howling around him. He raised a hand and pounded on the wooden door, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. He leaned in close, putting his mouth near the frame. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. "Is anyone in there?" There was no answer. Only the relentless, lonely fury of the wind. There was no answer. Ben shouted again, his voice snatched away by the wind the moment it left his lips. He knew waiting was not an option. Time was the enemy now, as much as the cold. He put his shoulder to the low door and pushed. It groaned, but held fast, blocked by a solid drift of snow. He dug his heels in, clearing snow away with his boots in a frantic rush, and then pushed again, this time putting all his weight, all his desperation, into the effort. With a sharp crack of splintering wood, the door gave way, swinging inward into darkness. Ben stumbled inside, immediately enveloped by a profound and absolute cold. It was a dead, still cold, somehow more menacing than the biting wind outside. He pulled the door shut behind him, the roar of the storm instantly muffled, replaced by an unnerving silence. He clicked on his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a sharp white cone through the gloom. The cabin was a single, small room, even more Spartan than his own. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and cold ashes. His light swept across a simple cot, a small wooden table, and an old, pot-bellied stove that stood dark and lifeless in the center of the room. And then the beam found them. On the floor, next to an overturned wooden chair, lay an old man. He was motionless, his body curled on its side. Lying faithfully beside him, her body pressed against his chest like a living blanket, was the gray ghost, Sadie. She lifted her head as the light hit her, and for the first time, Ben saw not a stoic sentinel, but a creature exhausted and afraid. A low, soft whine escaped her throat, a sound of desperate appeal. Her eyes, ancient and intelligent, were fixed on him, pleading. Ben's mind went quiet. The fear, the desperation, the ghosts of his past, they all vanished, replaced by the calm, focused clarity of his training. He was no longer a recluse. He was a first responder. He knelt beside the man, his movements swift and sure. The man was old, perhaps 90 years old, with thin, snow-white hair and a face etched with the deep lines of a long and arduous life. His skin had a pale, bluish tint, and when Ben pressed his fingers to the man's neck, the pulse was terrifyingly weak and thready, a faint flutter against the profound cold of his skin. This was severe hypothermia. The overturned chair told the story of a fall, but the cold was the immediate killer. His training dictated the priorities with brutal simplicity. 1. Restore warmth. 2. Assess injuries. 3. Do not move the patient. "Sadie," Ben said, his voice low and calm. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of her name. "Good girl. Let me help him." He turned his attention to the pot-bellied stove. It was his only hope. He found a wood box beside it, half full of dry, split logs. His fingers were numb, clumsy with cold, but he worked with a practiced efficiency, clearing the old ashes, checking the flue, and arranging a small pile of kindling. He fumbled with his waterproof matches, the first one sputtering out. The second one caught. He held the tiny, precious flame to the wood shavings, whispering encouragement as if to a living thing. A small orange tongue of fire licked the kindling, faltered, then grew, catching on a larger piece of wood. The fire was lit. While the stove began its slow work of pushing back the deadly chill, Ben turned back to the old man. He found a pile of rough wool blankets on the cot and gently draped them over him, tucking them in to trap any nascent warmth. He did a quick but thorough physical assessment, his hands running along the man's limbs, checking for the telltale signs of a break or dislocation from the fall. He found a significant bruise on the man's hip, but, thankfully, no obvious fractures. "All right, sir," Ben said softly, speaking more to himself and the dog than to the unconscious figure. "Let's get you warmed up. My name is Ben. We're going to be okay." He would. Sadie watched his every move, her head resting on her paws, her body a tight coil of hope and fear. She did not interfere, seemed to understand that he was there to help. The small cabin began to fill with the welcome crackle of the fire and the faint scent of wood smoke. The temperature in the room began a slow, almost imperceptible climb from dangerously cold to merely freezing. Ben had done everything he could. He had won the first, most critical battle. He rose stiffly, his own body aching with cold and exhaustion, and walked to the single, frost-covered window. He scraped a small patch clear with his fingernail and peered outside. The world was gone. The blizzard had intensified, a solid, impenetrable wall of swirling white. The wind shrieked with a new, higher-pitched fury. There would be no leaving this place. Not tonight. Not until the storm decided to release them. He looked at the old man, whose breathing seemed a little less shallow now, in the growing warmth. He looked at the loyal dog, whose eyes had never left her master's face. He looked at the fire, a small beacon of life, in a house of silence, trapped in the heart of a merciless storm. He had control of the situation inside this room, but they were prisoners, all three of them, cut off from the world, waiting for the fury of winter to pass. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the unabating howl of the wind outside. Ben kept a quiet vigil, adding logs to the stove, his body running on the last reserves of adrenaline and a grim sense of duty. He had managed to get a few sips of water into the old man, and the deathly blue tint in his skin had begun to recede, replaced by the pale, wrinkled texture of old age. Sadie had not moved, a gray and white statue of devotion at her master's side. It was deep in the night when the old man's eyelids fluttered. A low groan escaped his chapped lips. Ben was at his side in an instant. "Easy now," Ben said softly. "You're all right. You took a bad fall." The man's eyes, a surprisingly sharp and lucid blue, blinked slowly, trying to focus. They darted around the room before settling on Ben, filled with a weary confusion. His first word was a dry, raspy whisper. "Sadie? She's right here," Ben reassured him. "She's the one who saved you. She never left your side." The man's gaze shifted to the dog, and a look of profound relief softened his hard, wrinkled features. Sadie met his gaze and thumped her tail once, a weak but clear signal against the wooden floor. Ben explained what had happened, his voice calm and concise. He told him about the silent ritual, the growing concern, the storm, and the desperate search that had led him to this door. The old man listened without interruption, his breathing shallow but steady. When Ben finished, the man was silent for a long time, his eyes on the fire. "My name is Arthur," he said finally, his voice a little stronger. "I am in your debt, son. I don't know how I can repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Ben said, settling back on a small wooden stool he had pulled near the stove. "We look out for our own." As the cabin grew warmer, the small details of Arthur's life began to emerge from the shadows. The room was a testament to a long life, simply lived. On the rough wooden mantelpiece above the stove sat a few framed photographs. One showed a smiling young woman with kind eyes, her hair styled in a way that spoke of a bygone era. Next to it was a photo of a much younger Arthur, straight-backed and proud in a crisp army uniform. Tucked in a corner was a small, hand-carved wooden bluebird, its paint faded and chipped. It was not a house of possessions, but of memories. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, two strangers bound by a storm and a dog. It was Ben who finally broke it, unable to hold back the question that had driven him through the blizzard. "Arthur," he began, "your dog, Sadie. For weeks, she's come to my property, every single afternoon. She sits on a flat rock at the edge of the woods and just watches my cabin." "Why?" Arthur's gaze drifted to the photograph of the smiling woman. A sad, gentle look came into his eyes. "That's my Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with an old, well-worn grief. "My wife. She's been gone 10 years now." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She loved these mountains more than anyone I ever knew. And that spot, that clearing with the flat rock, that was her place. She said it had the best view of the sunset. We would sit there for hours. Sadie was her dog, you see. The last gift I ever gave her, after Eleanor passed. Sadie just started going back there, every day. At first I thought she was waiting for her to come home, but now I think I understand. She's not waiting, she's remembering." The mystery was solved, and the truth was more poignant than anything Ben could have imagined. The Gray Ghost's ritual was not a mystery. It was a memorial, a daily pilgrimage of love and loyalty. "She's a good soldier," Ben said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Arthur's sharp blue eyes met his. He nodded toward the mantelpiece. "I see you noticed my old uniform. Korea." "Afghanistan," Ben replied, the single word a complete story in itself. An invisible bridge formed between them in that moment, spanning the decades that separated their wars. They did not speak of combat or the horrors they had seen. They spoke of the things that came after, the feeling of being a stranger in your own home, the quiet that was never truly quiet, the difficulty of explaining a life that others could never understand. They were two soldiers from two different lifetimes, sharing stories by the light of a single fire, finding in each other a rare and profound empathy. Ben looked from Arthur, whose gaze had returned to the photo of his Eleanor, to Sadie, who was now sleeping soundly, her body finally relaxed in the warmth and safety of the cabin. A wave of understanding washed over him. He saw it then, with perfect clarity. Sadie's unwavering loyalty was not just a dog's instinct. It was a perfect, pure reflection of the love Arthur still held for his wife. The man and the dog were locked in the same faithful ritual, each keeping the memory of the woman they loved alive in their own silent, steadfast way. They were both guardians of her memory. And in that small, storm-battered cabin, Ben felt the icy walls around his own heart begin to thaw, just a little. Ben woke to an unfamiliar sensation: quiet. The relentless howl of the wind had ceased, replaced by a profound, muffled silence. He sat up, his body stiff and sore, and saw a sliver of brilliant, clean light slicing through a gap in the window frost. The storm had broken. He looked over at Arthur, The old man was awake, propped up on one elbow, his blue eyes clear and alert. He looked weak, but the immediate crisis had passed. "Morning, soldier," Arthur rasped, a faint smile touching his lips. "Sounds like the war is over." "Morning, Arthur," Ben replied, a genuine warmth spreading through his chest. "Looks like we have a truce." After a simple meal of Ben's protein bars and melted snow for water, Arthur insisted on getting up. He was unsteady, leaning heavily on the table for support, his bruised hip causing him to wince, but there was a stubborn fire in his eyes. Ben, sensing the man's need for dignity and purpose, didn't argue. Instead, he simply stood by, ready to offer a steadying arm. Together, they surveyed the minor damage the storm had wrought upon the small cabin. A shutter had been torn loose from a window, and the path to the woodpile was buried under a massive drift. The work was simple, but it was essential. Ben provided the strength, his powerful shoulders easily clearing a path through the heavy, wet snow. Arthur, leaning against the cabin wall, provided the direction and a lifetime's worth of practical knowledge, showing Ben how to resecure the old shutter with a bit of wire and a pair of rusty pliers. They worked in an easy, comfortable rhythm, their movements economical, their words few but meaningful. It was the kind of teamwork Ben hadn't experienced since he left the service, a shared task that built a bond stronger than any lengthy conversation could. Sadie watched them from the doorway, her head cocked, her quiet presence a silent approval of their new partnership. In the shared labor of rebuilding, their fragile, storm-forged friendship was being reinforced, strengthened into something solid and lasting. When the work was done, Arthur looked out at the transformed world, a dazzling landscape of untouched white under a piercingly blue sky. "A world washed clean," he said quietly. "Come on, let's breathe some of that new air." India. 8 men. They walked out together into the bright, cold morning. The air was so crisp it felt sharp in the lungs, scrubbed clean of everything but the scent of pine and snow. It was a world reborn. Ben, who had only seen this mountain as a fortress, a place to hide, now saw it through Arthur's eyes. The old man, though leaning on a sturdy branch for support, moved with a quiet authority in this domain. He was the true guardian of this place. He pointed to a delicate line of tracks stitched across the fresh snow. "White-tailed deer," he explained, "passed through here not long after the wind died, looking for breakfast." A little further on, he pointed to a flurry of disturbed snow near the base of a fir tree. "Fox and a snowshoe hare had a disagreement here. Looks like the hare won this round." Arthur shared the mountain's secrets with Ben, reading the story of the night written in the snow. He spoke of the way the oaks held the snow, of how to find your way by the moss on the north side of the trees, of the hawk they had seen a few weeks ago. For the first time, Ben was not just looking at the wilderness, he was seeing it. He was a student, listening intently to the old soldier who was teaching him not about war and survival, but about life and continuity. The mountain was no longer a silent, empty fortress. It was alive, full of stories, and he was slowly, tentatively, becoming a part of it. Sadie walked with them, and her transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. She no longer kept her respectful distance. She trotted comfortably between the two men, her beautiful gray and white coat a stark contrast against the snow. Her tail, for the first time in Ben's presence, gave a slow, gentle wag. She was the bridge between them, the loyal soldier whose duty had led them to this moment of peace. As they turned to head back to the cabin, Sadie trotted up alongside Ben and gently nudged his hand with her cold, wet nose. It was a simple, profound gesture of trust and acceptance. Ben stopped walking. He looked down into her old, wise eyes, and he saw not a mystery, but a friend. Slowly, he reached down and rested his hand on top of her head, his fingers sinking into the thick, soft fur behind her ears. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment in contentment. The invisible leash, the mysterious bond of loyalty that had pulled him from his solitude and into a raging storm, was no longer invisible. It had become a real and tangible connection, a warm and living thing that now bound all three of them. Ben stood there, his hand resting on the faithful dog, with his new friend by his side, breathing in the clean mountain air. The silence that surrounded them was not the silence of loneliness, but the quiet, comforting silence of belonging. The snow from the great storm melted, and the mountain shrugged off its heavy white blanket, revealing the tender green shoots of early spring. The world was waking up, and so was Ben. The rigid, lonely routine that had once governed his life had vanished, replaced by a new set of rhythms, ones that were marked not by solitude, but by companionship. A well-worn path now connected his cabin to Arthur's, a physical manifestation of the bond between them. Most mornings, Ben would walk over to Arthur's Edoa Cha, a thermos of hot coffee in hand. They would sit on the old man's porch while Sadie dozed at their feet, watching the sun climb over the Appalachian peaks. Ben would chop wood for them both, the rhythmic thud of the axe no longer a desperate attempt to silence his mind, but the simple, satisfying work of caring for a friend. Arthur, in turn, would share his stories, his knowledge of the woods, and his quiet, steadfast wisdom. They became a familiar sight, two solitary men who were no longer alone. Sometimes they would work together for hours in comfortable silence, mending a fence or tending to Arthur's small garden. Other times they would talk for hours, their conversations meandering from the price of feed in the nearest town to the subtle differences between the call of a raven and a crow. They were, in the truest sense of the word, friends, indispensable to one another. Sadie was the heart of their small, unlikely family. She no longer kept her solemn vigil at the edge of the woods. Her mission was complete. Now, she divided her time happily between the two cabins, a furry gray and white ambassador of goodwill. She would often accompany Ben on his walks, trotting at his side with a quiet contentment, her presence a constant, comforting reassurance. Ben discovered a new kind of peace, one he had never imagined possible. He had come to these mountains seeking the peace of emptiness, a quiet void where his ghosts could not find him. But that was a fragile, defensive peace, a peace that could be shattered by a single, violent dream. The peace he found now was something else entirely. It was a peace built from connection. He found it in the easy silence he shared with Arthur, a silence that was not empty, but full of unspoken understanding. He found it in the sense of purpose that came from helping his elderly friend, knowing that his strength was needed, that he was making a difference in someone's life. And most of all, he found it in the simple, unconditional companionship of Sadie. The quiet nudge of her head against his hand, the soft thud of her tail against the floorboards. These were the sounds of his new, truer peace. The nightmares did not disappear entirely, but they came less often, and their power was diminished. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were now just faint echoes, their chaotic shouts drowned out by the steady, quiet rhythm of his new life. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was being redefined by what he had found. One late spring evening, as the air cooled and the sky deepened to a soft violet, the three of them sat together on Arthur's porch. A gentle breeze rustled the new leaves on the trees. Arthur was in his favorite rocking chair, a patchwork quilt over his knees. Ben sat on the steps, leaning back against a porch post. At his feet, Sadie rested her head on his boot, her breathing slow and even. They looked out at the vast, dark silhouette of the mountain against the fading light. Ben remembered seeing that same mountain on his first day here, seeing it as a wall, a barrier to hide behind. Now, he saw it as something else. He saw the slope where he and Arthur had identified deer tracks. He saw the tall pine where they often saw a hawk circling. He saw the distant ridge that led to the clearing where Sadie had kept her faithful vigil. He was not hiding from the world here. He was a part of it. Arthur's rocking chair creaked softly, the only sound in the peaceful twilight. Sadie sighed in her sleep. Ben reached down and stroked her soft fur, his heart full of a quiet, profound gratitude. He had come here, a ghost of a man, seeking to disappear, And instead, he had been found. He had been led, by the invisible leash of a loyal dog's love for a memory, out of the storm and into the quiet warmth of a home. He was no longer a soldier on a lonely watch. He was a friend. He was a neighbor. He was healed, not by silence, but by the unbreakable bond of loyalty and love that now connected him, the old soldier, and the faithful dog. Perhaps the deepest connections are not the ones we seek, but the ones that find us in our loneliest moments, guided by a loyalty we never knew we needed. The story of Ben, Arthur, and Sadie is a quiet reminder that a single, steadfast heart can be the lighthouse that guides us home through any storm. If this tale of an unbreakable bond resonated with you, we would be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Every like and share helps these stories find others who may need them, and by subscribing, you help us keep these voices alive. Another story of hope is waiting for you now on the screen, and we would love for you to join us there.